She was only 7, a girl with a sketchbook and sunshine in her laugh. Until the van came, until the silence swallowed her whole. In a city that turned away from her, one old German shepherd growled back at the darkness. He was hours from being put down, until a broken journalist walked into the shelter and saw something left to save. What happened next silenced a courtroom, and when a little girl finally whispered 4 simple words, the world wept. In the heat-heavy stillness of a Jackson afternoon, the world felt like it was holding its breath. The magnolia trees outside the Bell household drooped lazily, their white blossoms weighed down by sun and sorrow yet to come. On the small patch of dry, patchy grass behind a weathered, clapboard house, 7-year-old Amara Bell twirled with a ribbon in her hand, the hem of her yellow sundress blooming like a sunflower in motion. Her skin glowed a rich, deep brown, and her hair was gathered into neat puffballs by her mother that morning, 3 of them, one for each time Amara had promised not to argue about brushing. She was slight for her age, all knees and elbows, with a laugh that used to come easily and loudly, though on this day, it had been replaced by a kind of dreamy silence. Amara was a quiet child by nature, introspective, often more interested in the pictures she drew than the games other children played. She liked sketching things that didn't move, birds on wires, cats on porches, the way the clouds hung like thoughts above the world. Her favorite sketchbook sat open on the porch swing, a page half filled with the shape of a van, though she hadn't realized yet why she had started drawing it. Inside the house, Sarah Bell, Amara's mother, stood at the kitchen sink scrubbing a pot with practiced force. Sarah was 36, tall and angular, her shoulders perpetually tense from years of holding things together that wanted to fall apart. Her eyes, soft hazel behind cheap drugstore glasses, were the kind that always seemed to be scanning for what might go wrong next. Once, Sarah had been a music teacher at Jefferson High, the kind who played piano with her eyes closed and made teenagers cry with the way she sang Billie Holiday. But then came the layoffs, and then came the fire that took her husband's workshop and nearly took his life. Since then, Sarah had become someone who didn't hum anymore. She worked 3 shifts a week cleaning houses and sold baked goods from her porch on Saturdays. Still, despite the weight she carried, Sarah remained kind to neighbors, never raised her voice at her children, and always kept the front yard swept, even if the house behind it creaked with wear. At that moment, her 12-year-old son, Elijah Bell, sat cross-legged on the hallway floor, sketching floor plans for a homemade drone. He was thin and wiry, taller than most kids his age, with long fingers that always seemed to be twitching with unspoken thoughts. He had their father's steady hands and their mother's quiet watchfulness, but with a streak of defiance just beginning to bloom. Elijah was the kind of child who read manuals for fun and didn't believe in magic, but believed in fixing things, anything. He had been watching his sister from the hallway window, glancing up every now and then between lines of calculations. At 2:47 p.m., Sarah's phone rang, a number from out of state, her sister in Atlanta. Sarah answered and stepped into the living room, the conversation pulling her further and further from the window. Elijah, caught in a particularly difficult design problem, looked away too. Outside, the van pulled up smooth and silent, like it had done it before. It was white, with windows that had been painted black from the inside. The man who stepped out wore a UPS shirt, wrinkled with no name tag. He had the kind of face that was easy to forget. Thin lips, wire-frame glasses, thinning blonde hair swept back in a way that made his skull look longer than it was. Marcus Griggs, though nobody knew that name yet. He was 49, a man with no digital footprint, no bank account, and 3 state IDs. His eyes, pale gray like old dishwater, had scanned neighborhoods like this one many times before. "Hey, sweetheart," he said, crouching to Amara's eye level. His voice was syrupy, slow and practiced. "You like puppies?" Amara stopped twirling, her ribbon fluttering to the ground. She looked at the van, then back at the man. "Yes," she said quietly. "I got a whole litter in the back. Special kind. They need a little girl to take care of them. Want to see?" She hesitated, tilted her head like she did when she was thinking hard. He extended a hand, not touching, just offering. She didn't take it, but she stepped forward. 2 steps. 3. From the house, Sarah's voice sliced through the open window. "Amara!" The man's head whipped up. The smile vanished. In a single movement, he grabbed the girl by the wrist. She froze. Not screamed, not cried, just froze. Something ancient in her small body had shut everything down. Across the street, 82-year-old Mrs. Claudette Jenkins, retired nurse and known neighborhood busybody, was walking her stubby-legged terrier. She saw it all. "Hey!" she barked, her voice sharp as a switch. "Get away from that baby!" That second of hesitation was all it took. Amara yanked back, ran. Sarah was already on the porch by then, sprinting, her voice cracking open the stillness. She scooped her daughter into her arms just as the van tires screamed into motion and left black marks across the asphalt. Within minutes, the police arrived. They took statements. Claudette described the man in detail, but nobody got a plate number. Elijah sat on the steps with Amara wrapped in a blanket beside him. She didn't cry, didn't talk, and just looked straight ahead. The next day, Sarah tried to feed her daughter scrambled eggs. She wouldn't eat, wouldn't draw, wouldn't speak. When Elijah asked her what kind of puppies they were, she flinched. The doctor called it selective mutism. Trauma response. Sarah called it breaking. 2 days later, Theo Madden sat at his cluttered desk in the newsroom of the Jackson Independent Press, rereading the report with an ache in his gut. He was 38, with a face carved by sleepless nights and coffee too strong. Once, he had been an idealist, winner of the Livingston Award at 28 for his investigative piece on foster care fraud. Now, he was mostly on desk duty, covering local council meetings and budget cuts. He wore old denim, typed fast, and smoked in secret. 3 years ago, he had received a tip about a missing black girl named Lanaya. He had filed the story late, buried it on page 9. That case had ended in tragedy. Her body found months later in a drainage ditch. No one held accountable. Now, staring at Amara's photo, the puffball hair, the wide eyes, the ribbon on her wrist, he felt it again. The shame. He stood abruptly, tossed the report into his satchel, grabbed his car keys. "Where are you going?" his editor called after him. "Someplace I should have gone 3 years ago." And with that, the journalist who once looked away turned the key in the ignition and drove toward the last house on Sycamore Street, toward a family unraveling and a girl who hadn't spoken since she ran from the edge of a van. The morning after the abduction, the Bell household felt like it had been gutted. The air was thin, every creak in the floorboards sharp like shattered glass. Sarah Bell moved through the house like a ghost in worn slippers, her frame even more drawn than usual, as if her body had resigned itself to fading. She hadn't slept, hadn't eaten. Her fingers trembled as she refolded the same blanket over the back of the couch for the 4th time. On the table sat the untouched eggs from yesterday. The kitchen clock ticked too loud, reminding her that the world outside didn't care if her daughter had gone silent. In Jackson, children like Amara went missing, and the city barely blinked. Elijah sat on the front steps, arms wrapped around his knees, his sketchbook open beside him. But today there were no blueprints, no mechanical dreams or codes. Only one page, nearly torn from how hard he'd pressed his pencil. A white van, the kind with no logos. A man's hand stretched out from it, long fingers like claws. His drawing had no face, just empty space where the eyes should have been. His jaw clenched as he stared at it. Theo Madden's old Ford pickup rumbled down Sycamore Street and stopped in front of the Bell home. It was an ugly thing, patched in places with duct tape and paint from a different decade, but it still ran. Theo stepped out with a brown satchel slung across one shoulder and 2 cups of coffee, both from a gas station down the road. He wore a wrinkled gray button-down and jeans stained with yesterday's urgency. His face hadn't seen a razor or good rest in at least a week, and the bags under his eyes carried more than just fatigue. Elijah looked up, half expecting another cop with another excuse. Instead, he saw something different in this man, something that looked like unfinished business. "Mind if I sit?" Theo asked, nodding toward the steps. Elijah shrugged. "You're the reporter." "Guilty." Theo handed him a coffee. "It's got too much sugar. I wasn't sure what you drank." "I'm 12. Theo cracked a grin. "Right. More for me." They sat in silence for a while, the kind of silence where grief lived, breathing between 2 people who didn't know each other, but knew pain. "You really trying to find her?" Elijah asked eventually. Theo nodded. "Yeah, and not just because it's my job. I should have done more last time." Elijah studied him, those sharp young eyes already old in ways they shouldn't be. "So what now?" Theo reached into his bag and pulled out a small plastic baggie. Inside was a scrap of yellow fabric, torn from Amara's ribbon, found near the curb where the van had idled. We find someone who listens better than we do. That's how they ended up at the Jackson County Animal Recovery Unit. Two strangers, a scrap of ribbon, and the kind of hope that only grows when everything else is dead. The unit sat at the edge of town, tucked behind an industrial park that always smelled faintly of chemicals. The front of the shelter looked more like a rundown vet clinic, with flaking blue paint and a flickering neon open sign that hadn't worked since spring. Inside, the air was thick with bleach and animal musk, and the constant low-level chorus of barks and whines. A receptionist with a braid of white hair and a tired smile greeted them. Marla, maybe in her late 50s, had the no-nonsense air of someone who'd bottle-fed orphaned kittens at 3 a.m. and buried more than her fair share of strays. She wore a faded volunteer shirt and kept her clipboard clutched like a shield. "Help you, boys?" Theo stepped forward, voice low but urgent. "We're looking for one of your retired K9S. I think he might be able to help us with a missing child." Marla squinted, skeptical. "You mean Solomon? That old boy? He's not exactly on the clock anymore. I just need a chance to show him something." She sighed, tapping her pen against the clipboard, then led them down a hallway that smelled of damp fur and disinfectant. As they passed the cages, Elijah glanced at the animals, some wagging, some shivering, all waiting. Solomon was in the last kennel. His name was scrawled in black marker on a duct-taped label. Solomon, K9, retired, euthanasia, scheduled 4 p.m. He lay on the concrete floor, unmoving except for the slow twitch of one ear. He was a German shepherd, 9 years old, though the gray around his muzzle and the stiffness in his joints made him look older. His fur was mostly sable, with a long scar running diagonally across his right flank, a legacy of a blade that had nearly ended his life during a raid 3 years prior. One of his back legs was slightly lame, a wound that never fully healed. He had once saved a hostage by lunging in front of a knife meant for an officer, and for that, he had been rewarded with forced retirement and a death date. Elijah moved closer to the bars, his voice barely above a whisper. "He doesn't look broken." "He's not," Theo said quietly, then to Marla, "Can we open it?" Marla hesitated. "Technically, he's off limits. He's got a few hours left, but if you've got something he can smell, I'll look the other way." Theo handed over the baggie. Marla opened the kennel door slowly, and Solomon didn't move until the scent hit him. Then he shot up with a growl so deep and guttural it made Elijah stumble back. His ears perked, eyes locked on the ribbon like it was something alive. He growled again, lower this time, pacing in a tight circle before letting out a high-pitched whine. Theo stepped forward. "He knows something!" Elijah's eyes widened. "He remembers her!" Solomon padded over to Theo, nudged the ribbon in his hand, then turned toward the hallway. He looked back once, waiting, expecting. Theo turned to Marla. "Cancel the euthanasia." Marla blinked. "You don't understand. I can't just—" "Then call whoever you have to. This dog isn't done yet." Back in the pickup truck, Solomon sat in the back seat, head raised, alert. Elijah kept glancing back at him like he still couldn't believe what was happening. Theo drove with both hands tight on the wheel, his mind racing with questions, regrets, and something else. Something new. Not redemption, but maybe the start of it. Theo Madden had signed the papers himself. The ink was still fresh, the shelter's fluorescent lights still flickering overhead when he scratched his name across the adoption form. It wasn't protocol, not under these circumstances, not when the dog in question had been scheduled to die before dinner. But then again, nothing about this was normal. Solomon now belonged to him. Legally, spiritually, in some strange, almost fated way, it felt like Solomon had been waiting for this. The old German shepherd rode in the bed of the truck, standing with a steadiness that belied his injured leg, his snout pressed against the crack of the rear window, eyes never leaving the road ahead. Inside the cab, Elijah sat passenger side, staring at a crumpled city map stretched across his lap. His fingers traced lines like veins through the sprawl of Jackson's neighborhoods, down toward the industrial outskirts, the forgotten places. Theo glanced sideways. "You're sure about this area?" Elijah nodded. "A friend of mine used to play near the train yard, said there were old warehouses out there. One of them's got power at night. No reason it should. Theo tightened his grip on the steering wheel. No reason is usually the best reason to check. By the time they reached the train yard, the sky was bruising at the edges, bleeding orange into deepening blue. The old rails had long since rusted, tangled with weeds and broken glass. The warehouse loomed ahead, one of those brick skeletons left over from the city's manufacturing days, boarded up and hollow-eyed. But this one had life, or something like it. A dim yellow bulb flickered above the rusted loading dock, and a thin trail of smoke curled from a pipe near the roof. Solomon jumped down from the truck with surprising grace for a dog his age. He sniffed the air, then crouched low, his tail straight and stiff. Elijah's voice was barely audible. "He's locked in." Theo pulled out his phone and tapped a number. The voice on the other end was clipped, irritated. "Madden?" "Detective Rayner, I need a unit at the old Stoddard warehouse near the rail junction. Something's happening here." Rayner grunted. "You working freelance or looking to get shot?" "I've got a traumatized kid missing, a possible human trafficking site, and a K-9 who's pointing straight at the front door. I need backup." A pause, then, "On my way." They waited in the shadows of an old rail car. Solomon paced, his growl low and constant. 15 minutes later, a black unmarked cruiser rolled in with no siren. Out stepped Detective Julian Rayner, early 50s, thick-chested and barrel-voiced. His gray beard was trimmed but wild, his shirt unbuttoned one extra notch in defiance of regulation. Rayner had been a fixture in Jackson's criminal task force for 2 decades. Tough, skeptical, and allergic to bullshit. He eyed Theo and Elijah like they were about to sell him a ghost story. "So, the dog told you there's a crime scene?" Theo simply pointed at Solomon. The dog was crouched again, this time near the side of the building, ears stiff, his body humming with tension. Rayner squinted, then gave a sharp nod. "Let's see if Lassie here knows something I don't." With weapons drawn and radios low, the team moved in. A side door gave way with a groan, and the warehouse interior unfolded like a breath held too long. The air was damp, metallic. Inside, beneath the cavernous ceiling and behind stacks of rotting crates, were 4 makeshift rooms crafted from plywood and tarp, and behind one of them, a sound. Shuffling, whispering, crying. Elijah was the first to move. He darted past a protesting Theo and Rayner and tore through the nearest curtain. Inside, he stopped dead. There, curled on a pile of old blankets, was Amara Bell. Her face was smudged with dirt, her hair wild and tangled, the ribbon long gone. But it was her. She was breathing, eyes open, though they were empty like a shuttered window. When she saw Elijah, she didn't cry, didn't speak. She only reached forward, slowly, trembling, and gripped the hem of his shirt. Her fingers clenched, and then she let go, curling back into herself. Solomon stepped into the room and everything changed. He didn't bark or lunge. He simply walked up to her and lay down, quiet, watchful, as if to say, "You're not alone anymore." She moved to him like a tide, slow and inevitable, her tiny arms wrapped around his neck. And finally, her body gave out, sobbing without sound, shaking with all the words she couldn't say. Rayner radioed for medical assistance, his face unreadable. 3 more kids in the next room, all alive, malnourished, scared out of their minds. "Looks like you were right, Madden." Theo didn't respond. He knelt beside Amara and Solomon, one hand gently resting on the old dog's back. "I wasn't right," he murmured. "The dog was." Across the warehouse, 2 officers led a man in handcuffs through the exit, tall, blonde, in a wrinkled UPS shirt. Elijah saw the face. Even in the dim light, he knew. It was him, the one from the van. The man's eyes met his for only a second, but it was long enough. Elijah's fists clenched, but he didn't speak. He simply turned back to his sister. Outside, ambulances waited. Amara was bundled into a blanket, IV already in her arm, medics murmuring kind words she didn't hear. Elijah sat beside her in the back of the vehicle, holding her hand, even though she didn't hold back. Sarah would be there soon. She had been unreachable, her phone dead. But now she was racing across the city, heart caught in her throat. Solomon was examined by one of the EMTs, a young woman with sharp cheekbones and a quiet voice. She ran her hands gently along his leg and muttered, "Old boy's still got some fight." She looked up at Theo. "Yours?" Theo nodded. "He is now." The medic smiled. "Lucky dog." Theo looked at Amara. "We all are." As the ambulance doors closed and the sirens began to rise, Theo stood watching them go. He felt the night press down on him, thick and humid, but he didn't flinch. Not this time. Behind him, Solomon nudged his leg and sat at his side, chest rising and falling like the last embers of a fire refusing to die. They had found the girl, but the silence she carried home was a wound no siren could heal. The days that followed the rescue unfolded slowly, like pages of a book no one had the heart to read. The world outside returned to its rhythm. Cars still honked, church bells still rang, and the air still hung heavy with southern heat. But inside the Bell home, time moved differently. Sarah Bell paced the floor with quiet urgency, always with one hand near the phone, the other brushing back stray curls from Amara's forehead. She had aged 10 years in 2 weeks. Her tall, angular frame looked gaunter than before, her cheekbones more prominent, her eyes rimmed red. The laughter lines that once framed her lips had been overwritten by worry. She hadn't returned to work. She hadn't picked up her violin. All that mattered now was this girl, this daughter, who had come back from the dark and hadn't spoken a single word since. Amara sat mostly in silence, clutching Solomon like a blanket come to life. The old German shepherd had taken up residence on her bedroom floor, his large frame curled just beside the bed, one ear always flicked in her direction. She would lay beside him, fingers absently tracing the long scar across his side, like it was a road map to somewhere she used to be. She hadn't drawn in days, but one afternoon, after Sarah left a stack of clean paper and some broken crayons by her bedside, Amara picked up a blue crayon and began to sketch. Her strokes were hesitant at first, then faster, more insistent. What emerged was a child's rendering of a van, a man, and something terrifying on his arm, a snake. That night, Sarah brought the drawings into the kitchen and laid them out before Theo Madden, who now spent most evenings at the Bell House. The reporter sat hunched over the table, elbows digging into the scratched wood, his shirt still unbuttoned at the collar, his sleeves rolled to the forearms. He hadn't shaved since the rescue, and the new beard made his face seem heavier, more lined with regret. His gaze moved slowly from one drawing to the next, each line seeming to dig a little deeper into him. "She remembers more than she lets on," Sarah whispered, arms folded across her chest. "That tattoo, it's always there." Theo nodded slowly, then reached for his leather messenger bag. From it, he drew a worn, crumpled file, one of dozens he'd pulled from his own archives over the past week. Inside were old clippings, photos, anonymous tips he'd once discarded. A familiar face stared back at him. Marcus Griggs, in a mugshot from 5 years ago, arrested in connection to a warehouse robbery on the Louisiana border. The tattoo visible just below the rolled-up sleeve, a snake coiled around a cross. He closed the file and leaned back in his chair. "I had this before," he murmured, almost to himself. 3 years ago, an anonymous source sent it to me, said the guy was running something out of Jackson. I didn't follow it, didn't print it, said it wasn't enough." He looked up, eyes dull with exhaustion. "Maybe if I had, she wouldn't have been in that warehouse." Sarah's voice was cold and level. "But you saved her." "No," Theo replied. "The dog saved her. I just wrote a story too late." From the hallway came the soft pad of paws. Solomon entered the kitchen, tail swaying gently. Behind him walked Elijah, barefoot, his oversized t-shirt hanging off one shoulder. He held something behind his back. "Amara drew this for you," he said quietly, handing a folded paper to Theo. Theo unfolded it. A picture. Amara's small, careful lines depicted Solomon standing between her and a man with hollow eyes. She had drawn herself smiling. For the first time. Theo felt his throat tighten. "Thanks, kid," he whispered. Later that week, they began sessions with Dr. Laura Whitman, a trauma therapist who worked closely with canine-assisted therapy. In her mid-40s, Laura was soft-spoken but sharp, with short salt-and-pepper curls and calm eyes the color of riverstone. She had a quiet presence that settled over a room like a blanket, and children often trusted her before they even knew why. She had worked with refugees, assault victims, and children pulled from the worst corners of the city. Nothing surprised her anymore. But Amara's bond with Solomon moved her deeply. In the therapy room, a sunlit space filled with pillows, warm lamps, and walls covered in watercolor prints, Amara sat on a mat with Solomon beside her. Laura sat nearby, cross-legged, holding a basket of colored pencils. "You don't have to talk today," she said softly. "You don't ever have to talk unless you want to. But I was wondering if you'd draw something for me." Amara looked at her, then looked at Solomon. The old dog rested his chin on her knee. Slowly, Amara took the paper. She drew the warehouse. Theo, watching from the other side of the one-way mirror, gripped the windowsill hard enough to whiten his knuckles. He hadn't been inside the therapy room. Not yet. Laura had said it would take time, but he came to every session, sat in that quiet hallway with its smell of crayons and chamomile tea, and watched a little girl slowly find her way back to herself. And each time she picked up a pencil, he felt both relief and guilt churn in his gut. The image of the tattoo haunted him more than the face that wore it, because he had seen that tattoo once before, not just in the file, but in real life. 3 years ago, in a courtroom covering a drug bust, he had seen a man step into the hallway with that same ink slithering up his arm. It had meant nothing then, just another ghost among many. Now, it was a brand burned into memory. Later that evening, back at his apartment, a one-bedroom walk-up with too many books and not enough light, Theo sat at his desk and opened a new Word document. The headline blinked, "The Girl Who Spoke Through Silence." But he didn't type. He stared at the screen, hands hovering over the keys. Then, instead of writing, he stood, crossed the room, and opened a drawer in a locked cabinet. From it, he took out a sealed envelope, yellowing at the edges, addressed in ink to a woman named Lania Thomas, another girl who had gone missing years ago, a letter he had written but never sent. He opened it now, reread the words, and then placed it beside a new folder labeled Magnolia Case, Griggs. Outside, night settled over Jackson. On Sycamore Street, the lights in the Bell House dimmed one by one, save for the small lamp in Amara's room, where Solomon slept curled around her like a fortress made of fur and loyalty. In her hands, Amara held a drawing she hadn't shown anyone. Not yet. It was a picture of Theo, sitting at a desk, a pen in his hand, and a glowing line connecting his heart to a dog and a girl on the other side of the page. She couldn't speak it, but somehow she knew. He was trying to save her, too. The courthouse in downtown Jackson rose like a monolith of old promises. Some kept, most broken. Its limestone pillars bore the weight of 1,000 verdicts, yet inside its thick walls, justice still bent too often to the will of convenience. The hearing was scheduled for 9 a.m. sharp, but by 8:20, the steps outside were already crowded. News vans parked along the street like vultures awaiting a carcass. Reporters buzzed about with microphones and cameras, some drawn by curiosity, others by something more visceral, a need to witness whether a little black girl could challenge a system that had long ignored her kind. Inside, the fluorescent lights cast an unforgiving glare over the courtroom. The judge's bench loomed over everything like a pulpit, and below it sat the 2 long, time-worn tables, one for the prosecution, one for the defense. In the back row of the gallery, Theo Madden stood beside Sarah Bell, both watching as Elijah helped Amara into a child-sized chair beside the witness stand. Sarah wore a pressed white blouse and gray slacks, her hair pulled back in a severe twist that framed her drawn face like a sculpted warning. She looked elegant, unshaken, but her hands wouldn't stop fidgeting in her lap. In the days since Amara's return, Sarah had softened around her daughter, but to the world, she wore her armor tight, protective, unyielding, like any mother asked to put her child back on display for the sake of due process. Amara sat silently, legs swinging just above the floor, her small fingers gripping the leash of Solomon, who lay at her feet like a living shield. The German shepherd had been freshly bathed for the occasion, his sable coat brushed to a dull sheen, the scar on his flank now less angry, though still pronounced. Despite the courtroom noise, Solomon remained still, eyes forward, ears at attention. The presiding judge, Margaret Kavanaugh, was in her early 60s with a stiff black robe and an expression carved from stone. She was known for her no-nonsense demeanor and a meticulous adherence to protocol. Her gray hair was cut short and precise, and the only jewelry she wore was a small silver cross at her throat. She tapped her gavel twice, calling the room to order. Before the proceedings began, the defense attorney, Robert Delaney, a tall, silver-haired man with a shark smile and polished shoes, stood and addressed the court. Your Honor, we object to the presence of the canine in the courtroom. The visual of a large, intimidating dog beside a child witness presents an undue emotional bias and may compromise the objectivity of the jury. Without missing a beat, the prosecutor, Jenna Morales, a Latina woman in her early 40s with sharp cheekbones and a voice that sliced cleanly through noise, stood in response. Your Honor, Miss Bell has been diagnosed with selective mutism following the trauma she endured. The dog is a certified therapy animal, necessary for her participation in this hearing. To deny his presence is to silence the victim all over again. Judge Kavanaugh adjusted her glasses, eyes sweeping from Delaney to Amara, pausing briefly on Solomon. She leaned forward, voice even. The presence of the dog is hereby permitted. Any further objections can be raised through formal appeal after the hearing. The murmurs in the courtroom settled into a tense hush. Amara did not speak when the questioning began. She didn't nod. She didn't shake her head. But then, when Jenna approached with a soft tone and a photograph of the man now sitting at the defendant's table, Marcus Griggs, whose blank stare betrayed nothing, Amara raised her hand slightly. Her fingers twitched in a deliberate pattern, a motion subtle enough to be missed by most, but not by Solomon. The old dog's body tensed, ears pricked, and a low, guttural growl rumbled deep from his chest. It was not loud, but it was unmistakable, and it shook the room. Gasps rippled through the gallery. The court clerk dropped a pen. Judge Kavanaugh froze mid-note, her brow furrowed. Griggs, for the first time, blinked. His left hand twitched on the table. The prosecutor didn't speak. She let the silence stretch, let it weigh down on everyone like a truth no one wanted to acknowledge out loud. Theo, from the back of the courtroom, felt his heart claw up into his throat. He had seen the footage a dozen times. The body cam from Detective Rayner's team, the raw and grainy clip of Solomon barking into the darkness of that warehouse. The moment they found Amara. The moment Griggs was dragged from the shadows. He had cut the footage together the night before, fingers trembling, breath shallow, watching frame by frame as the truth unraveled on screen. That morning, he had sent the video and the first few paragraphs of his story to a national publication, The Guardian Sun, with a single-line subject: "She deserves to be heard." Now, as Solomon's growl echoed in the courtroom, Theo's phone vibrated in his pocket. He glanced down. From Martin Bishop. Subject: urgent. Pull the video. Executive team says this crosses liability lines. We're not running the story. If you publish under our name, consider your position terminated. Theo exhaled slowly, one hand in his coat pocket, fingers curling around the vibrating device like it were a grenade. His jaw tightened, eyes fixed on the back of Griggs's head. He could say nothing, or he could say everything. But not now. Judge Kavanaugh banged the gavel once. Court will recess for 10 minutes. As the room slowly emptied, Amara didn't move. She remained seated, one hand still resting gently on Solomon's neck. Her gaze, fixed and unblinking, never left Griggs. Jenna leaned in beside her. "You did good, Amara." The girl said nothing, but Solomon's tail tapped twice against the floor. Outside the courthouse, Theo stood beneath the magnolia tree near the steps. He lit a cigarette with fingers that shook slightly. The camera crews hadn't seen him yet. Behind him, the heavy door creaked open. Jenna Morales stepped out, heels clicking softly against the stone. "Are you okay?" she asked. Theo didn't turn. They pulled the story. Jenna crossed her arms. "Then leak it." "I could lose my job." Jenna's voice was steel. "That girl nearly lost her life." Theo dropped the cigarette and crushed it under his heel. "I know." Then he looked up at the courthouse dome, where the afternoon light broke through stormy clouds and fractured rays. Somewhere inside, a little girl sat beside a dog who had growled at evil, while men in suits debated her right to be believed. He pulled his phone from his pocket and hit send. The trial resumed under heavy skies. Rain tapped steadily against the courtroom windows, an uneven metronome to a drama unfolding in restrained tones and coded language. The smell of damp wool and tension clung to the air. Judge Margaret Kavanaugh called the room to order with a single sharp rap of the gavel, her silver cross necklace catching the light just briefly as she adjusted her robes. Her face was carved with fatigue, and her voice bore the weight of someone carrying too many truths and not enough tools to shape them. At the defense table, Marcus Griggs sat with the same blank expression he'd worn since day one. His hair, once carefully combed, now hung limp, and the faint stubble on his jaw gave him the look of a man who had stopped trying to perform innocence. But his eyes, those pale, washed-out grays, remained sharp, darting between every speaker, calculating angles. Defense attorney Robert Delaney stood first. His suit was still pressed, his tie a muted navy. He looked the part of composure, but sweat had begun to bead near his temple. "Your Honor," he began, "my client continues to deny all allegations brought against him. There is no physical evidence placing him at the scene of the alleged abduction. The child's identification remains circumstantial, based on the presence of an animal, and therefore—" "The child," interrupted Jenna Morales, rising from the prosecution's table, "has provided consistent nonverbal testimony. In addition, we now submit new forensic evidence for the court's consideration." A murmur swept through the room. Judge Kavanaugh lifted one hand, silencing it. Theo Madden sat in the gallery, back straight despite the stiff wooden bench. His phone buzzed in his jacket pocket again. He didn't check it. He didn't need to. He knew it was his editor, or legal, or maybe HR. One last warning. The video had gone viral overnight. His article had been picked up by every major outlet except the one he'd worked for, and this morning, without ceremony, his badge no longer opened the front door to the newsroom. Across from him, Sarah Bell sat beside Amara, one arm around her daughter's shoulders, the other resting gently on Solomon's broad back. Sarah's hair was down today, curling softly around her face, and though her blouse was clean and crisp, her eyes were tired. But they were also defiant, the kind of tired that grows roots into steel. Amara, silent as ever, clutched a fresh sketch pad in her lap. She hadn't drawn during the trial until this morning. A monitor was wheeled into the courtroom. The bailiff, Officer Leland, a lanky man in his 40s with thin lips and a posture far too rigid, connected the drive and nodded at Judge Kavanaugh. "Play it," she instructed. The video was grainy, dated by its timestamp, 3 years prior. It showed the inside of an abandoned strip mall, lit only by the narrow beam of a body cam flashlight. The officer, Detective Harris, could be heard breathing heavily, his voice clipped as he moved through a set of back offices. Solomon, younger then but still unmistakable, came into frame. His body was taut, head low, tail stiff. And then, the growl, a sharp, instinctive sound that filled the small space. The camera turned. A man exited one of the back rooms, brushing past a shelf. The face was blurred, but the build, the posture, the faded UPS patch on the sleeve, it matched Griggs. Solomon's growl grew louder. The video paused. Jenna stepped forward. "Your Honor, we submit this video not as definitive proof of guilt in that previous case, though it remains unresolved, but to demonstrate a behavioral pattern, the same dog reacting the same way to the same suspect." Delaney stood quickly. "That footage was never part of a formal case. The man was not charged. The dog's reaction is not a legal standard." Judge Kavanaugh leaned back in her chair. "It's not. But it is relevant. Continue." Jenna nodded and moved to the next piece of evidence, a set of drawings. Not forensic photos, not lab reports. Children's art submitted by Amara Bell and 3 other rescued children. Every image, drawn in separate rooms on different days, showed a tall man with a snake tattoo on his arm and a van in the background. The bailiff passed the images to the jury. Delaney shifted uneasily. Back in the gallery, Theo glanced down at his phone, then silenced it for good. He would write again. Just not under the nameplate of the Jackson Independent Press. Maybe that was a blessing. He had grown too comfortable with gatekeeping, too used to the idea that someone else would sound the alarm, that someone else would risk their neck. But when Amara had looked at him this morning, held up her drawing of him with Solomon, and written in small, careful letters, "The man who hears me," he had known there was no going back. He was no longer a reporter for a corporation. He was a witness. The trial moved forward. Forensics confirmed that trace DNA had been recovered from fibers in the warehouse and matched to Griggs. A partial fingerprint on a broken flashlight found near the children's holding room, aligned with his record. Delaney tried to pivot, called into question the chain of custody, tried to deflect with talk of unreliable forensics and the emotional influence of a dog on a child. But the jury watched Solomon, who remained still as ever, unmoving except for the occasional turn of his ears or blink of those amber eyes. Amara never spoke. She didn't have to. Her drawing spoke louder than words. Her dog growled at the right man. Her silence roared in a room that once would have overlooked her. As the hearing adjourned for the day, the air outside had cooled. Rain had washed the dust off the streets. Theo stood under the courthouse overhang, watching the clouds break. Beside him, Sarah lit a cigarette with a practiced hand. She didn't offer him one. She didn't need to. "You really gave up your job?" she asked after a while. He nodded. "I gave up the version of myself that needed it." She glanced at him, measuring. "And what now?" "I write," he said, "without a leash." Sarah exhaled, the smoke curling around her like armor. "Good. We need more like you. Fewer men who only listen after the screaming starts." Inside the building, Amara waited by the elevators with Elijah and Solomon. The dog's tail wagged once, twice, then stilled. The mirror had finally shown its reflection, and justice, though late, had begun to knock. The courtroom was silent in that unnerving way only rooms holding too much truth could be. The type of silence that didn't invite stillness, but demanded attention. Not even the sound of papers rustling or chairs creaking dared interrupt the pause that had spread like wildfire after the prosecution called their final witness, Amara Bell. The little girl stepped forward slowly, guided by her older brother Elijah. He had dressed himself in his best clothes, a too-big blue dress shirt tucked into jeans that showed the faintest wear at the knees, and carried himself with the quiet intensity of someone older than 12. His hand, small but steady, gripped Amara's as they approached the witness stand. Amara wore a white cotton dress, and her hair had been braided into soft rows, pulled neatly back with pink barrettes. Sarah had dressed her that morning with trembling hands and a prayer that didn't ask for strength, only presence. Beside them, Solomon walked with calm assurance, his frame dignified, ears perked, each step deliberate. Though graying at the muzzle, the German shepherd's posture remained proud, scar and all, as if he knew this was no ordinary walk. Judge Kavanaugh looked down from the bench, face unreadable but not cold. "Miss Bell," she said gently, "you may sit or stand, whatever makes you comfortable." Amara didn't speak. She sat quietly, one hand gripping the edge of the chair, the other resting lightly on Solomon's back. The dog's tail thumped once, soft, grounding. The prosecutor, Jenna Morales, approached with care. She didn't hold any papers, no photos, no evidence bags, just her voice. "Hi, Amara," she said. "I know you've been very brave to come here today. You don't have to say anything unless you want to, but I want you to know we believe you, and we trust you." Amara looked at her, blinked once. Jenna stepped back, giving her space. Delaney, the defense attorney, glanced nervously at Griggs, who sat stiffly at the defense table. For the first time, sweat glistened along his hairline. His lips had tightened into a straight, bloodless line. Then something happened. Amara reached forward with her right hand and tapped twice on the wood of the stand. Slowly she turned her head, her eyes landing on Griggs. Her expression didn't change. Her lips parted. Not wide, not dramatically, but just enough. A whisper, almost too soft to catch, slipped through the courtroom. "Solomon knows." Gasps rippled across the room like a wind slicing through dry leaves. Jenna froze. Judge Kavanaugh's eyebrows lifted ever so slightly. Delaney turned pale. Griggs blinked, then blurted, "She remembers me?" The words exploded into the room like a shattering mirror. Silence followed, sharp and immediate. Then came the reaction. Not from the people, but from the dog. Solomon stood in a single fluid motion. His body went rigid, his head lifted, and a low, unmistakable growl started in his throat. It wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of something ancient and righteous. His eyes locked on Griggs with a focus that chilled even the bailiff. The judge didn't stop him. No one did. Because in that moment, it wasn't just a dog growling. It was justice itself, unspoken and undeniable. Griggs's lawyer leaned in, whispering furiously, but the damage was done. Griggs, who had remained silent for most of the trial, had just admitted recognition, had just confirmed the very thing he had spent weeks denying. Theo, sitting in the gallery with his pen hanging limp over his notepad, felt something clench in his chest. It wasn't triumph. It was something quieter, more sacred. He looked to Sarah, who had tears trailing silently down her cheeks, one hand over her mouth. Elijah was frozen, his wide eyes fixed on his sister, like she had just done something miraculous. Because she had. Amara turned back toward Jenna. Her lips didn't move again. She placed her hand on Solomon's head and leaned into him gently. Solomon sat back down, his body once again calm, but his eyes never left the man who had tried to steal a child. The judge cleared her throat. Court will recess for 20 minutes. Her voice cracked slightly, the mask of formality slipping for the briefest moment. As the room began to shift into motion, Theo stood and left through a side door, walking out into the hallway where the storm clouds from earlier had finally broken into a soft drizzle. He leaned against the cold marble wall and exhaled deeply. The rain soaked his sleeves as he stood there, unmoving. A voice joined him after a few moments. "Feels different now," said a woman in a charcoal coat. Her name was Marlene Rooks, a retired journalist who had once mentored Theo during his earliest years. She was short and sturdy, her dark skin wrinkled but radiant, her gray dreadlocks tied back in a bun. The kind of different you don't undo. Theo glanced at her, eyes red-rimmed. She said something. "I heard. I think I forgot what that felt like." "To bear witness?" she asked. He nodded. "You remembered in time," she said, and put a hand on his shoulder before walking away. Back inside the courtroom, Griggs sat like a man unraveling. No one had touched him. No one had yelled. But a little girl had spoken 4 words, and a dog had growled. And somehow, that had been enough to crack him open. In the minutes that followed, the court reconvened briefly. The judge confirmed the transcript, the audible statement, the timing, the reaction. The jury had heard it all. Griggs's outburst had been spontaneous, unprovoked, and worse, unscripted. His attorney asked for a postponement. Denied. The damage had lodged too deeply. As the day closed, Amara returned home with Sarah and Elijah. She sat on the couch beside Solomon, one hand still stroking his fur. Sarah made tea in silence, the whistle of the kettle a lullaby to fill the spaces where words were still learning to return. Theo arrived later, holding a brown envelope. "I want her to have this," he told Sarah. Inside were newspaper clippings, printouts of the story. The viral headlines, the whisper that broke the silence. Beneath it, a photograph. Amara sitting beside Solomon, her hand mid-sketch, eyes steady. Sarah didn't speak. She just nodded and walked over to her daughter. Amara took the envelope. She didn't smile, but she didn't look away. That night, as the wind hummed through the streets of Jackson and rain tapped gently against the windows, Amara climbed into bed. Solomon curled beside her, his breathing slow and constant. She leaned close to his ear, so quiet only he could hear. "Thank you." And for the first time since the rescue, she fell asleep without shaking. Spring came gently to Jackson, as if it knew this year required a softer hand. The magnolia trees along Sycamore Street bloomed with a stubborn grace, white petals like pieces of light breaking through months of shadow. The Bell House, once sunken in quiet grief, now breathed with the cautious rhythms of healing. Laughter, still rare, had begun to echo softly in corners, and even the dust that lingered on old photo frames seemed less heavy. Inside the kitchen, Sarah Bell stirred pancake batter with a touch more cinnamon than usual. Her hair was tied up in a scarf, loose strands curling at her temples. She moved with the efficiency of a woman who had learned, painfully, to keep her hands busy when her heart overflowed. Though the lines around her mouth remained deep, there was warmth in her movements now, and her smile, still rare, had stopped looking like an apology. At the table, Elijah sat with his laptop open, hunched over an article draft for Magnolia Voices, the organization Theo Madden had launched just 1 month after leaving the Jackson Independent Press. The headline read, "When the smallest voice is the loudest truth." The article was about Amara, though he'd written it in third person, as if it hurt a little less to write her story like it belonged to someone else. Solomon lay stretched out beneath the table, his chin resting on his paws, tail flicking slightly whenever Elijah shifted his feet. The German Shepherd looked older these days, the fur around his muzzle nearly white, but there was a calm nobility in the way he carried his weight, a silent testament to the fact that survival, too, is a kind of victory. In the living room, Amara stood in front of the mirror wearing her white graduation dress. The cotton ruffled slightly at the sleeves, and a pink ribbon was tied at her waist. Her hair had been styled into soft braids, each one ending with a colorful bead that clicked gently when she moved. She touched the fabric with reverence. It was the first time in a long while she had cared about how something looked. Sarah walked in and paused, her throat tightening at the sight. "You ready, baby?" Amara turned and nodded. "I think so." Her voice, though still quiet, held a steadiness that had not been there before. It was not just the voice of a survivor, but of someone who had learned that silence and strength could coexist, and that breaking the silence, when she chose to, was power. Outside, Theo waited beside his old pickup truck, now cleaned and repainted, the back converted into a mobile storytelling studio for Magnolia Voices. He wore a linen shirt and rolled-up sleeves, his beard trimmed for the first time in weeks. He carried a folder of children's art from other survivors, some colorful, some haunting, all profound. He smiled as the bells stepped outside. "You clean up all right," he said to Amara. Amara tilted her head and replied, "You still talk too much?" Sarah let out a laugh, the kind that pulled from somewhere deep. She got that from her daddy. Elijah grinned and helped Solomon climb into the truck bed, where a soft mat had been laid just for him. Amara followed, sitting beside the dog, her small hand resting on his back. They drove through Jackson, past buildings that once blurred into the same tired gray, now seeming to stand taller, brighter, somehow more awake. The elementary school lawn was dotted with folding chairs, balloons, and plastic streamers. Families milled about in Sunday best. There were teachers in floral dresses, old grandparents in wide-brimmed hats, and students beaming behind crooked caps. Principal Mrs. Boudreau, a wide-hipped black woman with a booming voice and a heart that wrapped itself around every child she taught, stood at the podium in large gold earrings and a smile made for photographs. When Amara's name was called, there was a long moment of pause, not because anyone doubted her presence, but because of what it meant. She stepped forward slowly, each footstep measured, her back straight. Solomon padded beside her, wearing a navy blue bandana with the word hero stitched in white thread. The crowd didn't erupt into applause. They stood. It was not planned. It was not prompted. It was reverence. She accepted her certificate and turned to face them, holding it close to her chest. Then she turned to Solomon, knelt in front of him, and pressed her forehead gently to his. Her hands cupped his face as she whispered the words only he could hear. "I don't have to say much, because you've always heard me anyway." His tail wagged, soft and slow. Later that afternoon at the community center, a small gathering was held for Magnolia Voices, a quiet celebration for the young storytellers, the survivors, the ones who had lived through fire and learned to write in the ash. Theo stepped up to the mic. There were no lights, no media, just folding chairs, lemonade, and truth. He looked at Elijah, who was organizing the art wall, sketches from Amara, from other children now learning to tell what happened through color and line. He looked at Sarah, who sat with her arms around Amara, both of them swaying slightly to a slow jazz tune played by a local band. And he looked at Solomon, sleeping beside the podium, his chest rising and falling peacefully, one ear twitching in rhythm to the music. Theo cleared his throat. "We are not defined by the worst thing that ever happened to us," he began, "and we are not made whole by forgetting it either. We heal by naming the pain, by telling it, by sharing it, and by honoring those who helped us survive it." He paused. "And sometimes," he added, glancing down at the old shepherd, "those heroes walk on 4 legs." The room clapped, not loudly, but long. And for the first time in a long time, Jackson felt a little different. Outside, the magnolias bloomed with reckless beauty. Their petals didn't ask permission to fall, and neither did the children rising beneath them. Sometimes the voice that saves us isn't loud. Sometimes it's the whisper of a child, the growl of an old dog, or the still small voice of God moving through the broken places we've learned to live with. What happened to Amara was cruel, but what happened after, her healing, her courage, her first whispered words, was nothing short of a miracle. Not the kind with trumpets or thunder, but the quiet kind. The kind that shows up in a scarred old German shepherd who refused to die before finishing his purpose, in a mother who held on even when the world forgot her, in a boy who didn't stop searching, and in a man who finally chose truth over comfort. In a world that often forgets the voiceless, this story reminds us, God hears what the world overlooks. He speaks through love, through loyalty, through a child's drawing, through the beating heart of a dog once deemed worthless. So, if you're watching this, we ask you, take a moment, whisper a prayer, not just for Amara or for Solomon, but for every child still waiting to be heard. May God bless your home, your children, your quiet battles. And may you always remember, even the smallest voice can move heaven. If this story touched your heart, please leave a comment, share it with someone who needs hope today. Subscribe for more real stories of healing, love, and the quiet miracles that walk among us. Together, we can remind the world, not all heroes wear capes, some have fur. He never planned to come back, just a quiet walk, one last sunrise with his dogs, but fate had other plans. The townspeople whispered, "An old man with war dogs roaming our streets, he's lost it." What they didn't know was that each step he took was part of a silent promise to a woman he lost and a child he had never met, until now. The sun had barely begun its slow climb above the frostbitten rooftops of Red Willow, Wyoming, when a peculiar procession emerged from the morning fog. 5 German shepherds, large, sleek, and alert, padded silently along the wooden boardwalk that curved around the harbor. Their formation was almost military, 2 on each side, 1 at the front, each step synchronized. No leashes, no collars, no words spoken. Just a presence, firm and unseen, guiding them. Behind them walked a man. Walter Brecklin was 71 years old, though he looked younger from afar. Tall and broad-shouldered, his back still unbowed. Up close, time had carved its marks into his weathered face, deep lines at the corners of his eyes, a faded scar on his left temple from a long-forgotten scuffle. His hands, rough and calloused, swung at his sides with a natural steadiness, every motion practiced and precise. He wore an old brown field jacket with a faded police patch barely visible on one shoulder, and a wool cap pulled low over graying hair. Walter was a retired K-9 officer, though most in Red Willow only knew him as the widower with the dogs. He rarely spoke to anyone, didn't attend town hall meetings, declined every church invitation. After losing his wife, Miriam, to lung cancer 3 years ago, he had drifted quietly to the edge of town, both literally and figuratively, settling in a worn wooden house near the bluff that overlooked Red Willow Harbor. His dogs were his only company. There was Max, the leader, jet black, muscular, and calm as stone. He was 10 years old, once trained in narcotics detection. Shadow, a sable-coated female with a crooked ear, had once saved a boy from drowning. Blitz, gray and white with a ragged tail, had been shot in the line of duty. Ember, the youngest at 5, was lean, eager, and watched Walter like he hung the moon. And finally Rex, the slowest of the 5, with cloudy eyes and a slight limp. Walter's oldest partner, retired for nearly a decade. Together, they moved as if connected by invisible threads. Shopkeepers peered through windows, coffee mugs paused halfway to lips. Tourists snapped blurry photos from across the street. "It ain't natural," muttered Hank Tolliver, a retired mechanic with a gut shaped like a watermelon. "No leashes, no collars. Those dogs could turn on someone any second." "They haven't yet," replied Sheila Monroe, owner of the Red Willow Deli, wiping her hands on a flour-dusted apron. She had a kind face, soft and creased from years of smiling. Besides, you'd think he was marching soldiers, the way they follow. The chatter was low but persistent. Some admired the discipline. Others feared the unpredictability. Walter never acknowledged the whispers. He simply walked his route, from the edge of the bluff, down along the harbor, past the old fish market, and back up through Main Street. Rain or snow, dawn after dawn. That particular morning, a new pair of eyes watched him. Ruby Lynn stood just outside the corner bookstore, her breath rising in clouds. She held a camera in gloved hands, the lens capped but ready. Ruby was 32, with sharp cheekbones, shoulder-length jet-black hair, and a gaze that missed very little. A former city crime reporter, she had moved to Red Willow only 2 weeks prior, escaping the burnout of urban journalism. Red Willow was meant to be quiet, a break. But the sight of 5 shepherds moving in eerie harmony without a leash or a word had flipped a switch in her brain. Something's off, she thought. No one commands that kind of control without a story. Ruby had grown up in Oakland, raised by her single father, a Vietnam veteran who spoke little but taught her to read between the lines. Her natural skepticism was less a choice and more a survival mechanism. Even in a town this small, she knew better than to take things at face value. She followed from a distance, keeping her boots light on the snow-dusted boardwalk. Walter didn't look back. He never did. As the procession passed the shuttered ice cream parlor, a small black cat darted across the boardwalk. Blitz lunged slightly, instinct flaring, but Walter lifted his left hand an inch, palm open. The dog stopped instantly. Ruby's eyebrows lifted. No voice, no leash, just one motion. She raised her camera and snapped a single shot. That moment, the man, the dogs, the cat pausing mid-dash, froze into something mythic. Later, in the warmth of her rented studio apartment above the bakery, Ruby loaded the photo into her laptop. She stared at it long, zoomed in, examined the posture of the man, the eyes of the dogs, the shadowed grief etched into his face. She opened a blank document and typed the headline, "The Ghost of Red Willow, Who is the Man Behind the Dogs?" But she didn't hit save, not yet. Instead, she leaned back, staring through the window at the fading light on the harbor. There was a story here, maybe even more than one. She just had to be careful, because sometimes the quietest people carry the loudest histories. And some dogs, they were trained to protect secrets. Walter stood still beneath the brittle limbs of a bare cottonwood tree in the center of Magnolia Park, his breath curling in the morning air. Before him, the 5 German shepherds sat in a half circle, their eyes locked onto his hands, awaiting the next command. The sun hadn't fully risen, and the town was still rubbing the sleep from its eyes, but the park, usually a place of laughter and bicycle bells, was silent but for the soft scrape of paws against dry grass. Walter moved. Not much. Just a subtle shift of his wrist and a twitch of 2 fingers. Instantly, Shadow rolled left. Max took 2 strides forward, and Ember leapt onto the park bench with flawless precision. They moved not like dogs, but like trained dancers, performing a silent ballet choreographed by memory and trust. Walter gave no praise aloud. He didn't need to. Watching from behind a rusting wrought iron fence, Ruby Lynn observed through her telephoto lens. But it was no longer about the story. Not fully. It was personal now, because this morning her younger brother Milo had insisted on coming along. Milo Lynn was 10, with thin arms, a mop of untamed dark hair, and an ever-present notebook he clutched like a security blanket. He rarely spoke, not since their mother passed away 2 years ago in a sudden accident that no one wanted to talk about anymore. Diagnosed with high-functioning autism at 7, Milo had always been sensitive to noise, smell, and most of all, people. But today, he had gotten out of bed, dressed himself in mismatched socks and a bright yellow hoodie, and said, "I want to see the dog man." Ruby nearly dropped her coffee. Now, crouched beside her, Milo watched Walter with a gaze as intense as the dog's, studying not just what happened, but how. He had drawn the dogs in his notebook the night before, carefully labeling each one. Black 1 equals sign, Max, Alpha. Small, fast 1 equals sign, Ember, Scout. 1 with cloudy eye equals sign, Rex, Old Warrior. Ruby had meant to ask where he got the names. She hadn't yet. In the park, Walter paused and knelt beside Blitz, checking the dog's back paw. The movement tugged at Ruby's memory, old surveillance tapes of Walter from years ago, back when she worked crime in Denver. She'd only half believed the rumors. The dog whisperer cop, with a 90% recovery rate. The guy who once tracked a kidnapped child across 3 counties with nothing but a flashlight, a shepherd, and no backup. Urban legend stuff. But here he was, grayer, quieter, but still magnetic in that strange, unspoken way. She pulled her gaze from the lens and looked at Milo. He was smiling. It wasn't big or dramatic, but it was there. A small shift in the tightness of his face, the way his lips curved ever so slightly upward. She hadn't seen that expression in almost a year. At that moment, a voice interrupted. "Y'all stalking the dog man? Or just admiring the view?" Ruby looked up to see a woman leaning against the fence, with a paper bag in one hand and a thermos in the other. She was in her 50s, heavy-set but graceful in movement, with silver-streaked hair tied into a low bun. She wore a patchy denim jacket covered in hand-sewn embroidery, sunflowers, crescent moons, even a stitched lizard curling near the elbow. "I run the flower shop on Pine," she said. "Name's Nora Givens. Ruby stood, brushing snowflakes off her coat. "Ruby, and this is Milo." Nora nodded, eyes softening as she glanced down. "Morning, Milo." He didn't respond, but he didn't hide either. "You're not the first to watch him," Nora said, nodding toward Walter. "Town's been watching that man for years, whether they admit it or not." Ruby raised an eyebrow. "And what do they think they're watching?" Nora sipped from her thermos. "A man who remembers too much, mostly. A ghost who hasn't quite let go. You know he used to be a cop, right?" "I've heard." "Then you know about Miriam, too?" Ruby hesitated. "His wife?" Nora nodded slowly, her voice gentling. "They were married 42 years. She was the one who started training dogs before he did. Cancer took her fast. He hasn't said more than 10 words to anyone since the funeral, except to them." She nodded toward the shepherds. "They're the only ones who still hear him." In the park, Walter rose and gave a flick of his hand. The dogs realigned instantly, sitting in a perfect straight row. He turned and began walking toward the far edge of the park where the trees thickened. To Ruby's surprise, Milo stood and stepped closer to the fence, fingers gripping the bars. His voice, soft, hesitant, broke the cold air. "That one," he whispered, pointing to Ember. "She's the scout. She always checks the back first, every time." Ruby turned sharply. "You've noticed that?" Milo nodded. "She's the youngest. She's nervous, but fast. She likes patterns." Ruby blinked, then gently touched her brother's shoulder. "You want to draw her when we get home?" "Can we stay?" Milo asked instead. "Just a little longer." Ruby swallowed a lump in her throat. "Yeah, kid, we can stay." Across the park, Walter slowed and glanced over his shoulder. He didn't wave, didn't smile, but his gaze settled briefly on Milo. Then, just barely visible from this distance, he tapped 2 fingers twice against his chest. Ruby didn't know what it meant, but Milo did. He tapped back. As Walter disappeared into the trees with his dogs trailing like shadows, Ruby turned toward Nora. "Do you think he'd talk to me?" "Not if you bring a microphone," Nora said with a wry smile. "But maybe, if you're patient, and if you mean it." "Mean what?" "That you're not just here for a story." Ruby didn't respond, not because she didn't have an answer, but because, for the first time in a long time, she wasn't sure what the answer was. Later that afternoon, she found Milo in his room, cross-legged on the carpet, drawing. His newest sketch showed a series of hand signals, tiny diagrams of fingers, arrows, movements. Next to each one was a dog's name and the action it caused. He looked up as she entered. "Do you think he'd teach me?" Ruby smiled. "I don't know, but I think you've already started learning." That night, long after Milo had gone to sleep, Ruby opened her laptop and stared again at the blank document with the headline, "The Ghost of Red Willow." This time, she deleted the title, then typed a new one, "The Man Who Speaks in Silence." She still didn't save it, but maybe, just maybe, she would. Soon. It happened on a Wednesday morning just after the first frost. The sun had barely lifted, and the streets of Red Willow shimmered with that translucent glaze only October could craft. Walter was midway through his usual route, moving quietly with Max and Shadow leading, the others fanned out behind like the practiced wings of a formation. His breath fogged the air, but his mind was clear, until he heard the screech. It came from the crosswalk near the corner of Maple and Ash. A girl, maybe 6 or 7, had lost control of her pink bicycle as she tried to navigate the slick road. She was hurtling downhill, her little legs outstretched, arms flailing, and ahead of her, unseen by her frantic eyes, was a delivery van backing out from the alley. Walter didn't yell, he didn't have time, but Shadow moved. The sable-coated German shepherd, 6 years old and known for her unusual perceptiveness, broke formation and darted toward the girl. Walter gave a single snap of his fingers, sharp, commanding, and the dog changed course, cutting across the bike's path. In a swift and practiced motion, Shadow collided gently with the front tire, throwing the girl off balance just enough for her to topple sideways into the grass instead of the oncoming van. The vehicle braked hard. The girl lay stunned but unharmed, her helmet cracked, knees scraped. The driver, a freckled teenager named Lucas Hayes, 19, lanky and still smelling like whatever fast food he delivered, jumped out of the van, stammering apologies. Walter said nothing. He simply knelt beside the girl, checked her pupils, wiped her bleeding knee with a handkerchief, and motioned for Shadow to lie beside her, tail thumping calmly. The girl's name was Ellie Vaughn, daughter of Sarah Vaughn, the newly hired school counselor. Sarah arrived within minutes, panic-stricken and breathless, dressed in running tights and a fraying cardigan, hair in a haphazard ponytail. She was in her late 30s, tall and bony, in a way that made her look both graceful and perpetually exhausted. Sarah had moved to Red Willow 2 months prior, trying to rebuild after a messy divorce and the collapse of her old school district due to funding cuts. "Ellie!" she called, voice cracking. But when she saw her daughter sitting quietly, petting Shadow's thick coat, her shoulders sagged in visible relief. Walter stood slowly as Sarah approached. He gave a short nod. Did you stop her?" Sarah asked, eyes flicking between him and the dog. Walter didn't speak. Instead, he gave Shadow a tap on the shoulder. The dog stood and nudged Ellie's hand gently before returning to the formation. Sarah watched, stunned. "Thank you," she said, softly but firmly. "Thank you for seeing her when I didn't." Walter nodded once more, and without another word, turned to leave, his dogs falling into place like an honor guard. By noon, the story had already spread. Some said he'd leapt into traffic himself. Others claimed he used military hand signals to stop the van mid-air. None were true, but all carried the same conclusion. Walter Brecklin had saved a child. Again. By sundown, Red Willow's whispers had turned to arguments. In Perkins' grocer near the produce aisle, 2 women debated loud enough for apples to bruise. "He's a hero," barked Judy Nielsen, a retired librarian with horn-rimmed glasses and a spine like a steel rod. "Those dogs should be praised, not feared." "But it's reckless," countered Denise Pratt, head of the neighborhood watch, her curly hair bouncing with indignation. "He walks 5 aggressive dogs without leashes. What happens when one snaps?" Across town, Ruby Lynn sat at her desk in the back of the bakery, typing furiously. She'd seen the aftermath: Ellie's scraped knees, Shadow's still tail as the child leaned against her, Sarah's trembling hands. Ruby had already drafted the headline, "The Shepherds of Red Willow, How an Old Man and His Dog Saved a Life." She hit send to her editor. An hour later, she got the reply. "Too controversial. Keep it local, Ruby. We can't afford backlash over leash laws." She stared at the email, her fingers frozen above the keyboard. Controversial? For saving a child? She didn't swear often, but now she did. Softly. And then louder. Milo peeked in from the hallway. He didn't startle, just observed. "What's wrong?" he asked, voice barely above a whisper. Ruby sighed. "They won't let me publish the story." Milo entered the room, barefoot and still in his cartoon pajamas, his notebook clutched against his chest. "They don't understand," he said, pulling himself up beside her. "But I do." He opened his notebook and flipped through the pages. Every signal Walter had used this morning was drawn in order, frame by frame. The finger snap, the palm shift, the dog's movement, Ellie's fall. Milo had captured it all in pencil, with arrows and diagrams that could have belonged in a training manual. Ruby stared at the drawings, astonished. "How did you remember all that?" "I didn't remember," he said quietly. "I felt it, the rhythm, like music. Like when Mom used to play piano." Ruby swallowed hard. Their mother had taught piano at a community college, filling the house with sonatas and broken keys until her death silenced the halls. Milo hadn't listened to music since, but now the memory had returned. Not through notes, but through motion. Walter's motions. Later that night, Ruby brought Milo's sketches to Nora Givens at the flower shop, hoping to gather support for a town petition, recognizing Walter's dogs as trained therapy animals. Nora looked through the drawings, then at Ruby. "You've got something more powerful than a headline here. This," she tapped the sketches, "this is testimony from someone who sees what most of us miss." Outside, the town remained divided. Rumors swirled that the mayor would push for new leash laws at the next council meeting, that Walter might be fined, that the dogs could be impounded if deemed a public risk. But in the kitchen of their small apartment above the bakery, Ruby taped one of Milo's sketches to the fridge. It showed Walter, hand raised like a conductor, with 5 dogs poised in a perfect arc around him. Above them, in Milo's small, uneven handwriting, were the words, "They listen, even when no one else does." And that night, before bed, Milo did something he hadn't done in months. He whistled, Just once, just a short, soft note. But it was enough to make Ruby close her laptop, tears prickling her eyes, and whisper into the quiet, "Good night, kiddo. I'm listening too." The lake in Red Willow looked like glass that morning, solid, pale, deceptive. A thin sheet of ice had formed overnight, rippling like frozen silk beneath the low winter sun. The air was sharp enough to cut, every breath a knife edge in the throat. Walter Brecklin walked his usual route along the lake's eastern edge, boots crunching over frost-covered soil, his dogs fanned out in their now familiar formation. Shadow and Max took the lead as always, their pace unhurried but purposeful, heads low, ears high. Then Ember stopped. She was the youngest, lean and sharp like a flame, with intelligent amber eyes that seemed too wise for 5 years. She stiffened just past the willow grove and gave a low, uncertain growl, a warning note, barely audible. Walter immediately paused. He narrowed his eyes toward the lake's edge, where thin reeds poked through snow. Nothing moved. Nothing obvious. But Ember didn't growl without reason. A short whistle from Walter, low and rising, sent Max into alert mode. His ears perked, body tensed. He trotted to the edge of the frozen bank and stopped. His tail rose. Then he barked, once sharp and loud. That was enough. Walter broke into a sprint, his knees protesting, but adrenaline silencing them. The dogs surged with him. There, beneath the semi-transparent ice near the shallows, was a shape, a dark lump. Too big for an animal, too small to be debris. Something moved, barely. Walter threw off his coat and dropped to his knees, sliding onto the bank. He slapped the ice. "Hey!" he shouted, voice breaking the usual silence he so religiously preserved. "Hey, can you hear me?" No answer, just the slow, terrible truth dawning. Someone had fallen through. He acted fast. Rex stayed at his side, an anchor of calm. Max circled wide, barking toward town in warning. Ember ran back the path they came from. Walter didn't call her back. He knew she'd fetch help. Shadow remained poised at the edge, tail stiff, watching every movement. Walter spotted a cane floating beneath the broken ice, and suddenly he knew exactly who it was. Harold Whitby, 83. The retired history teacher who lived 2 cabins down from the lake, known for his stubborn independence and long morning walks. A man with a limp and a fondness for telling ghost stories to kids in the library. His face now pressed just below the surface, eyes fluttering open. Walter took a breath and did what most would call reckless. He plunged through. The ice cracked with a shriek and swallowed him instantly. Cold hit like lightning. He went under for only a second, but came up gasping, reaching for Harold, whose body floated limply. Walter gripped his collar and kicked against the water, hauling them both toward the nearest edge, toward Shadow, who now paced in panic along the ice. It was Rex, ancient, near-blind Rex, who made the difference. The old dog lay flat on the shore, extending his body over the ice, as if daring it to break too. Walter used the dog's outstretched frame to brace himself as he pulled Harold's body free from the water. By the time Ember returned with Sarah Vaughn, Nora Givens, and 2 teens from the bait shop, Walter was collapsed on the bank, coughing, soaked, shivering, but alive. Harold lay beside him, unconscious but breathing, water leaking from his nose. It wasn't long before an ambulance arrived, called by Sarah, while Nora wrapped Walter in blankets pulled from the back of her flower shop van. The EMTs praised Walter, but he said nothing. He just sat beside Rex, his hand buried in the dog's damp fur, and someone else had been watching. From across the lake, hidden behind a pine cluster, Ruby Lynn had seen it all. She hadn't meant to follow him, but after Milo began showing clear signs of emotional connection, talking more, eating better, asking questions, she couldn't ignore the thread between her brother's healing and the man with the dogs. She filmed everything, not out of instinct, but necessity. Because when people question miracles, it helps to have evidence. That night, she edited the footage into a 90-second clip. No voiceover, no music, just the cold, the chaos, the rescue. She uploaded it anonymously, using the title, "The Old Man by the Lake." Within hours, it was shared across Red Willow. By morning, it hit state news. By evening, it went national. And then, the pushback began. Councilwoman Judith Pratt, 62, short, stiff-necked, always in beige, went on record. "We must consider public safety. That man could have died. He could have pulled a child in with him. Dogs or no dogs, this kind of recklessness is not heroism." Ruby's article, now suddenly cleared for publication by her editor, was flooded with comments. Some called Walter a hero. Others called him dangerous. Some asked if he was mentally sound. Even Mayor Kendrick, a cautious man with a nervous habit of cleaning his glasses every 5 minutes, stated, "We are conducting an internal review of town safety protocols." But inside the Lynn apartment, something extraordinary was happening. Milo had spoken. Not once, not in fragments, in full sentences. "I watched him dive. He didn't even think. He just jumped." Ruby, halfway through her second coffee, blinked. "You... what?" "I saw him. The way Rex moved too, like they knew what to do without talking." He looked up. "That's what I want. I want to understand that language." She put down her cup. "You already do." Milo tilted his head. "Can we go back?" "I want to thank Rex." That afternoon they walked the icy path to Walter's cabin, where the man sat on the porch, a quilt over his shoulders, Rex lying at his feet. Milo stepped forward. His hand trembled as he reached toward the old dog. "Thank you," he whispered. Walter didn't reply. He simply nodded, his eyes softer than Ruby had ever seen. Milo crouched and laid his head gently on Rex's back. The dog didn't move, just closed his cloudy eyes and let the moment sit. When they left, Walter raised 2 fingers to his chest again. This time, Milo raised 2 fingers back, intentionally. Across the town, petitions began, protests sparked. People argued on porches, in grocery lines, on Facebook. They debated leash laws, mental health, elderly autonomy. But through it all, the one truth no one could deny was this: Walter had saved a life, and in doing so, had begun to awaken others. Not just Ellie, not just Harold, but a boy who hadn't spoken in years. Red Willow buzzed with opinions in the days after the lake incident. Some called Walter Brecklin a hero, a living legend. Others whispered more bitterly: reckless, unstable, a danger to himself and others. The town had split into quiet factions, those who nodded in solidarity when Walter passed by, and those who crossed the street, clutching children closer. None of it fazed Walter, not outwardly. He continued his dawn walks with his dogs, now accompanied more often by cautious glances and not-so-discreet cell phones. His pace never changed. Max still took the lead. Rex still limped loyally behind. But inside, something had shifted. He could feel it like a winter draft under the floorboards. Something was coming. And then Ruby found it. It started innocently, just background for a follow-up piece she was writing. She'd gone down to the Red Willow Historical Society, a cluttered one-room archive tucked between the town's bait shop and the post office. The clerk on duty, Miss Evelyn Hargrove, was a frail woman in her 70s, with horn-rimmed glasses and a fondness for gossip masked as helpfulness. "You're looking for old town records on Harold Whitby?" she asked, flipping through index cards with surprising speed for her age. "We've got council minutes back to 1984. That man's been petitioning about sidewalks since Reagan." "Actually," Ruby said carefully, "I'm more interested in any past interactions between him and Walter Brecklin." Evelyn tilted her head like a crow sensing something shiny. "Now, why would that be interesting?" Ruby smiled. "Research." 10 minutes later she found it. A town council transcript from 2002, buried in a footnote from a closed session meeting. Councilmember Franklin Moore motioned for disciplinary review of Officer Walter Brecklin, citing inappropriate prioritization of canine resources and insubordination during an off-record search and rescue. Ruby's heart stuttered. Franklin Moore, not Harold. She looked closer. Same last name, but different man. She cross-referenced. Harold's younger brother. Franklin Moore, former council member, now semi-retired, living in Red Willow's outer district. A man who had once tried to ruin Walter's career, long before the community knew Walter's name. A man who, last year, had suffered a stroke and moved back to Red Willow quietly under the care of a private nurse. A man who, last week, had taken a rare solo walk by the lake and nearly drowned. Ruby closed the file slowly. The man Walter had saved through sheer instinct was the same man who had tried to end his career. She returned home with a mind racing, facts swirling like snow in a storm. She could publish it, of course, and the internet would love it. But something made her pause. She looked across the room where Milo was sitting cross-legged on the floor, sketching yet another scene from memory, this one of Rex nudging Walter's shoulder after the rescue. "Milo," she said gently, "do you think Walter would want people to know he saved someone who tried to hurt him?" Milo didn't look up. He didn't save him because of who he was. He saved him because of who he is. Ruby said nothing more. But the next morning, Red Willow's town council said plenty. Councilwoman Judith Pratt stood in front of the old courthouse, with a line of official-looking papers clutched in manicured fingers. Her mouth, always tight, was drawn even tighter today. "We have uncovered past disciplinary concerns involving Mr. Brecklin's conduct during his time in law enforcement," she told a sparse audience of reporters and curious townspeople. "Combined with recent events, this council is recommending that Mr. Brecklin cease all public outings with his dogs until further assessment can be made." It wasn't a direct ban, but it was a threat. A message. Walter, when told of the statement by Nora at the flower shop, merely nodded and said, "Expected." That night, Ruby didn't sleep, neither did Milo, but for a different reason. At 2 in the morning, Milo awoke to a strange sound outside, the sharp, rhythmic clink of metal, and then a muffled grunt. He crept to the window of their upstairs apartment. Nothing. Then another sound. Closer this time. Something wasn't right. Quiet as a shadow, Milo pulled on a hoodie, grabbed a flashlight, and snuck outside. He didn't wake Ruby. He didn't hesitate. He followed the sounds across the quiet street, past the bakery, and toward the edge of the forest trail leading to Walter's house. The moon was dim, half hidden, and the air had the electric silence that always came before snow. As he neared the property, he saw movement near the side porch. 2 figures. One was unmistakably Walter, standing firm despite his age. The other, a man in his 30s, wiry, pale-skinned, with a backpack slung across one shoulder and a crowbar in hand. Milo froze. Walter's voice, low and even, reached him. "You picked the wrong house." Then Max growled, a sound like thunder rolled into flesh. The intruder didn't run. Instead, he lunged. There was a scuffle. Walter moved faster than expected for his age, blocking the man's path, but the intruder shoved him hard. Walter staggered back, losing his footing. Milo didn't think. He stepped out of the bushes and aimed the flashlight directly at the stranger's face. The beam struck like a punch. The man cursed, turned, just in time for Max to leap forward and pin him by the leg. Teeth sunk into denim. Walter called off the dog immediately, one sharp syllable like a crack. The man collapsed. The crowbar clattered away. Walter looked up, panting. His eyes met Milo's. In that moment, it didn't matter that Milo was 10 or small or had spent most of his life locked in silence. He had saved Walter. Police arrived 15 minutes later, called by a neighbor who'd heard the shouting. The man was identified as a drifter with prior burglary charges. No connection to Walter, just bad luck and worse timing. But the real news broke the next day. "Boy hero helps foil break-in at lake house," the headlines read. Milo's face wasn't published. Ruby made sure of that. But word spread. And for the first time in years, Milo stood at the center of something not for his difference, but for his courage. Walter never said thank you. But the next morning, he came to the bakery, placed a dog-eared book on the counter, a hand-drawn guide to canine training signals, and slid it toward Milo without a word. Milo smiled and whispered, "I've already started writing my own." Walter smiled back, a rare thing. The gymnasium of Red Willow Elementary smelled faintly of crayons, disinfectant, and warm folding chairs. Fluorescent lights buzzed above as parents, children, and curious residents shuffled into the modest space, guided by hand-drawn posters taped to hallway walls. Understanding Our Dogs, a special community presentation. Ruby Lynn stood near the entrance, checking the sign-in sheet with a pen tucked behind her ear. She wore a navy sweater and jeans, her usual professional look softened by a nervous excitement. This wasn't just a story anymore. It was a moment, one that had grown quietly in her apartment, and now reached beyond Milo, beyond Walter, even beyond the dogs. She had expected 20 people at most, but the room was nearly full. In the front row sat Principal Halford, a kind-eyed man in his 50s with a salt and pepper beard, and a fatherly patience developed from decades of managing children and school budgets alike. He offered Ruby a reassuring nod. Beside him, Mrs. Gertrude Phelps, the town librarian, clutched a knitted tote bag full of dog books. She was tall, slightly stooped, with thick glasses and a floral scarf wrapped tightly around her neck despite the heated room. At the far back, lingering near the exit, stood Councilwoman Judith Pratt, arms crossed, lips pinched, wearing her usual beige wool coat. Her presence was not for support, but scrutiny. Ruby took a deep breath. The folding table on the small stage was decorated simply. An easel with Milo's drawings, a clicker for the slideshow, and a placard that read, "Canine Communication by Milo Lynn, age 10. At exactly 6:05 p.m., Milo stepped onto the platform. He wore his best hoodie, a dark green one Ruby had ironed flat, and held a set of cue cards in one hand. His black hair was neatly combed for once, and a single pencil stuck out of his back pocket like a sword. He didn't look nervous. He looked ready. "Hi," he said into the microphone, voice a little too close, a little too loud. There was a chuckle from the audience. It relaxed the room. "My name is Milo. I used to not talk. Now I talk because of dogs." There were a few soft gasps, mostly from parents who knew the Lynn family only by passing nods. "My favorite is Max," he continued. "He doesn't need words. He watches your shoulders. He knows if you're scared. He knows if you're lying." He clicked the remote. A slide appeared, a diagram of Walter's hand signals, drawn in colored pencil, beautifully detailed, with arrows and symbols. This one means stay close. This one means circle left. This one means watch me. He demonstrated the hand motion slowly, and a small video played in the corner of the slide, showing Max following each command with flawless discipline. Gasps turned to applause. Milo smiled, barely, but to Ruby it was the brightest thing in the room. The presentation continued for 10 minutes, and by the end, even Judith Pratt's arms had fallen to her sides. People clapped louder than they expected, like something had been released from inside them. Then Ruby stepped up. "There's someone else I'd like you to hear from," she said. The room shifted, heads turned, murmurs buzzed like static. Walter Brecklin rose slowly from the third row, wearing his brown field jacket, as always. His cap was off tonight, revealing wisps of silver hair combed carefully back. He climbed the stage with Rex at his side, the old dog's pace slow but determined. Walter looked out across the crowd. He didn't fidget, didn't hold notes. His hands rested on Rex's back. "My wife's name was Miriam," he began. The room hushed instantly. "She was the reason any of this exists. The dogs, the training, the way they understand us, and the way they teach us to listen without needing noise." He paused. "She could make a dog sit just by changing how she breathed. I used to think it was magic. Later, I realized it was respect." Walter scanned the room. His voice was quiet, but steady. "She taught me everything I know about dogs, and about patience. And when I lost her, I stopped speaking because I didn't trust my voice to say anything worth hearing." People leaned forward. "But the dogs still listened," he continued, "especially Max. And little by little, so did Milo. And maybe some of you." His eyes found Ruby, then Milo. "I'm not a hero. I'm not even a good neighbor most days. But I know how to listen. And I think right now, that might be more important than talking." The applause didn't come right away. It rolled in slowly, like the tide, until the entire room stood. Even Judith Pratt tapped her palm once, reluctantly. But later, after the lights dimmed and the chairs stacked, the backlash came, as expected. An email arrived the next morning from the office of Dr. Leonard Corman, a psychologist from the Red Willow County Wellness Board. He was in his late 40s, clean-cut, with a permanent 5 o'clock shadow and an air of overcompensation. His note was professional, but the message was clear. "Due to recent public exposure and history of trauma, we request that Mr. Brecklin submit to a voluntary wellness assessment to ensure continued suitability for unsupervised interactions with minors and service animals." Walter read the letter silently at his kitchen table. Max lay at his feet, Rex nearby, snoring. He folded the letter, placed it neatly in a drawer, and poured himself coffee. He didn't need a psychologist to tell him he was still grieving, or that he woke some nights expecting Miriam's voice. or that the dogs were his sanity more than his service. He just needed to keep walking, keep showing up, keep listening. But across town, a different kind of letter was circulating, written by Principal Halford and signed by 62 parents. A petition not of complaint, but of support. We believe Walter Brecklin and his dogs have offered this town something rare, calm in the midst of fear, presence in a distracted world. He has taught our children, and us, that kindness doesn't always speak aloud, but it always shows up. And just below it, a handwritten edition from Milo himself. Max listens better than most people, and Walter is like Max. By week's end, the petition had over 200 names. Judith Pratt didn't comment, but she didn't call another hearing either. That Saturday, Ruby found Walter at the lake's edge again, watching the ducks slide clumsily across thin ice. Milo ran ahead, tossing a stick for Ember, who leapt and skidded like a pup. Ruby stood beside Walter, their shadows long in the winter sun. "You changed a lot of minds last night," she said. Walter didn't look at her. "I didn't mean to." She smiled. "That's why it worked." Rex groaned softly as he stretched beside them, and for a moment, beneath the still sky, the town of Red Willow felt, if only briefly, like it was healing. The snow started as a whisper, soft flakes swirling like feathers over Red Willow's rooftops. By mid-afternoon, it had become a low roar, pounding against windows, swallowing tire tracks, and blanketing the streets in white silence. By dusk, the power went out across town. No one had expected the storm to grow so fast. The last forecast called for light flurries. Instead, Red Willow was now buried beneath nearly 2 feet of snow, with wind gusts rattling shutters and toppling trash bins. Streetlights flickered and died. Cell towers blinked out one by one. Inside his cabin near the lake, Walter Brecklin moved like a man on autopilot. He lit the kerosene lamps, stocked the wood stove, and filled 5 bowls with kibble for the dogs. Max and Blitz curled near the fire. Ember sat by the front door, alert. Shadow paced restlessly. She felt it, something beyond the storm, a shift. Walter placed a hand on her head. "Easy, girl," he muttered. "We'll ride it out like always." But just as he turned to check the emergency radio, Ember let out a sharp, piercing bark, one that stopped him cold. That was her alert for distress, human distress. Walter moved quickly to the door, pulled on his coat, and stepped into the snow. Wind bit into his face, and the world was white noise and blowing shadows. "Search," he told them. The dogs scattered with practiced rhythm, Max taking point, Ember darting left, Shadow veering right. Walter followed with difficulty, his boots sinking with every step. The cold clawed into his chest. His breathing grew shallow. Then came the sound, a voice, faint, desperate. Walter followed it until he reached a stranded SUV wedged against a snowbank near the edge of a logging road. All 4 doors were sealed shut, nearly buried. The windshield was frosted over. Inside, a family huddled together. A man in his 40s with frostbitten fingers, a woman shivering in a thin jacket, and 2 children, twins maybe 8 years old, wrapped in a single blanket. Walter banged on the glass, shouted, and motioned for Max to dig. The dog launched into the snow with urgency, clearing space around the door. Walter used his gloved hands to clear the rest, finally wrenching the driver's side open. The man stared at him, wide-eyed. "We've been here since noon," he stammered. "Our phone died. No one came." Walter didn't respond. He helped the man out first, then the children, then the woman. He gave them his gloves, stripped off his jacket, and wrapped it around the kids. "Cabin's that way," he said hoarsely, pointing with a trembling hand. "Follow the dogs." The family obeyed without question. Max and Blitz led them down the path, heads down against the wind. Walter turned to follow, but his knees buckled. It wasn't dramatic. No gasp. No cry. Just a soft, final surrender of tired bones and a tired heart. He collapsed onto his side, barely conscious, snow already collecting in the folds of his shirt. Shadow was on him instantly. She nudged his face, whined, licked his cheek. No response. She sniffed him all over, circled, then darted off into the storm. She ran the path back to town, paws punching deep into the snow. When she reached the first cluster of homes, she howled, long and loud. Inside the Lynn apartment, Milo sat near the window, watching the snow fall like an avalanche of silence. He had been sketching Walter's cabin from memory. Then he heard it. A howl. Mournful. Urgent. Milo stood. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed his coat, his boots, his flashlight, and dashed out the door. Ruby shouted after him but didn't stop him. Something in his face, calm but determined, told her not to. Milo ran through the snow, following the sound. He found Shadow pacing in frantic loops. She turned the moment she saw him and bolted into the trees. Milo followed, stumbling through drifts nearly up to his knees, flashlight beam bouncing wildly. And then he saw him. Walter, lying in a shallow snowbank, half buried, not moving. Milo dropped to his knees beside him. "Walter?" he whispered. Nothing. Milo turned to Shadow. "Go," he said firmly. "Get help." She hesitated. "Go!" he shouted. Shadow ran. Milo placed his hands on Walter's chest and listened for breath. He found it. Faint. Shallow. He did everything he could remember from one of Ruby's documentaries. Tilt the head. Keep the airway open. Don't let him freeze. He wrapped his arms around Walter and stayed close, shielding his body with his own small frame. 10 minutes later, Shadow returned, this time with help. Sarah Vaughn arrived first, still in her pajamas, covered by a thick coat. Behind her came Ruby and Principal Halford, carrying blankets and a sled. They lifted Walter onto it, covered him, and hauled him back through the trees. By the time the sun broke through the storm the next morning, Walter was recovering in the town clinic. His blood pressure had stabilized. His heart was still ticking. Slow, stubborn, reliable. Ruby sat beside him, holding a cup of coffee. "You saved them," she said. Walter didn't respond right away. Then softly he said, "I just did what she would have done." "Miriam?" He nodded. "She'd be proud." He didn't answer, but his hand reached down to scratch behind Shadow's ears. The dog thumped her tail once and laid her head across his legs. Outside, the town began to stir. Word had spread fast about the rescue, the heart attack, and the boy who led the search party. They called Milo a hero, but when asked, all he said was, "I just listened, like Walter taught me." And so, Red Willow began to change, not all at once, but piece by piece. People started leaving water bowls on their porches for the dogs. Kids practiced hand signals in the schoolyard. Even Judith Pratt stopped by the clinic with a homemade pie, which she awkwardly placed on the counter without a word and left. For the first time in years, Walter's name was no longer a subject of division. It was a symbol of care, of resilience, of quiet, enduring loyalty. The storm had passed, but its memory lingered in Red Willow like the scent of pine after rain. The snow was melting in patches along the sidewalks, revealing the old cobblestones beneath. Windows reopened. Children returned to sledding, laughter echoing across the hills. The town had survived the blizzard, but something deeper had changed. It wasn't just relief, it was awakening. The town council building, once the scene of whispered doubts and quiet condemnation, now stood as the heart of something new. That morning, the chamber had been cleared of paperwork and formality. Rows of chairs faced a podium, decorated with a single vase of hand-picked wildflowers. Nora Givens's idea, of course. Ruby stood near the front, adjusting her notes, straightening Milo's collar, and wiping something invisible from his cheek. The boy stood taller now, more certain. He wore a gray sweatshirt with a paw print logo, one of several custom-made shirts stitched by the retired quilting club. His black hair was neatly combed, and in his hand, he held a rolled-up certificate with a blue ribbon tied around it. His fingers gripped it tightly, not from fear, but excitement. Across the room, Walter sat quietly with Max at his side, the other dogs resting at his feet like sentries at peace. He wore his field jacket, pressed and patched, and a freshly cleaned cap tucked under one arm. He didn't speak, but his eyes roamed the room, noticing everything. The softened expressions, the genuine smiles, the way even Judith Pratt nodded at him as she entered. Awkward, but sincere. Principal Halford stepped to the podium first. His voice, deep and calm, carried the weight of small-town leadership. "Today," he began, "we recognize more than a rescue. We recognize a teacher, a bridge, and a boy who reminded us what listening really means." He gestured toward Milo, who stepped forward to soft applause. "Today we launched the Companion Signals program," Halford continued. "An emotional support and canine training initiative for children with sensory and social development challenges. created in partnership with our own Ruby Lynn, inspired by her brother Milo, and guided by the expertise of Mr. Walter Brecklin. The applause grew louder. Ruby took the stage next, glowing, not from pride in her work, but in her brother. "When I moved to Red Willow, I came to escape the noise," she said. "But what I found was silence that speaks, in Walter, in his dogs, in Milo. And I learned that healing doesn't always happen in therapy rooms or under bright lights. Sometimes it happens in snowstorms, in the quiet space between breath and bark." There were misty eyes in the audience. Even Councilwoman Pratt dabbed the corner of her eye with a tissue, though she quickly blamed an allergy to dog fur. Then came Walter's turn. He rose slowly and walked to the podium without ceremony. Max followed and lay down at his feet. Walter scanned the room. "I was never good with crowds," he said, voice gravelly but clear. "Still ain't." A ripple of laughter. "But my wife was. Miriam. She taught dogs before I ever touched a leash. She taught patience, rhythm, kindness. Everything I know about them, I learned from her. And everything they know about people, they learned from her too." He paused. "She believed every kid could be reached. Some just needed a different kind of language." He looked toward Milo, who sat straight-backed, watching him with quiet intensity. "I didn't save this town," Walter continued. "You all saved yourselves. I just walked where the dogs led me." He nodded once, then returned to his seat without waiting for applause. But it came anyway. Loud, long, rising. That afternoon, in the same gymnasium where Milo had once given his first shaky presentation, the program officially began. A group of 5 children sat in a semicircle on yoga mats. Some bounced nervously, others clutched chewable necklaces or squeezed sensory balls. At the center stood Milo, now a junior mentor, demonstrating a simple hand signal: open palm to chest, hold, release. Max responded by stepping forward, sitting, and offering his paw. The children gasped. One giggled, another tried the signal herself. Too fast, too messy, but Ember still responded, trotting over and resting her head in the girl's lap. Sarah Vaughn, now an official child liaison for the program, observed from the corner with a clipboard and teary eyes. She had seen too many children shut down, locked behind walls of anxiety. Now she watched those walls tremble and slowly begin to fall. Later that evening, just before sunset, Ruby, Milo, and Walter walked together down the old harbor path. The sky was streaked with oranges and deep reds, the kind of color that makes you pause, whether you're ready to or not. Max walked beside Milo, their steps perfectly matched. Shadow and Blitz padded ahead, tails swaying gently. Ember trotted in and out of view, chasing snowflakes that had returned in brief flurries. Walter walked slowly, his coat zipped, his cap pulled low. He didn't speak until they reached the overlook, the same one he had stood on during those lonely mornings months ago, when the world felt narrower. He looked at the water, at the quiet town behind them, and then he said it. "She'd have liked this morning." Ruby turned to him, her expression soft. "Miriam?" she asked. He nodded. "She always said sunrise was just proof that we get another chance." The wind picked up, crisp but gentle. Milo leaned against the railing, his hand resting on Max's back. And together, the 3 of them, man, boy, woman, stood with 6 dogs watching the harbor glow beneath a crimson dawn. No need for more words. The silence spoke plenty. And maybe, just maybe, this whole story was never just about dogs or one quiet man. Maybe it was about how God still works in the silence. He doesn't always shout from mountaintops. Sometimes he speaks through the rustle of paws in the snow, through a child's first word after years of silence, or through an old man who just won't stop walking. Maybe it was God who sent Walter down that road at just the right moment. Maybe it was his hand that guided Max to the water, or Ember to the lost, or Shadow to dig when no one else could see. We talk so much about miracles, expecting them to be big and loud, but perhaps the greatest ones are quiet, faithful, and persistent. Just like Walter. Just like love. So, if you've ever felt forgotten, if your voice has been stuck for too long, or if you're waiting for a sign, maybe this story is it. God still sees you, and he's still in the business of rescuing hearts in unexpected ways. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment below. What part moved you the most? Subscribe to the channel for more stories that lift the soul And may God bless you, yes, you, the one reading this, with comfort, courage, and companions who know how to listen even when words fail. Amen.